Hey guys, it's WaifuGate. Normally I do like deck guides on Monday, but we're going to be doing something a little different today. I'm going to do half of the spoilers that have been out so far. Right now the date is 6/15/2020. So we're going to go through these, probably two pages of these, and then make another video for 3 and 4. And we're just going to do that periodically to keep up with it all. That way we don't do what we did last season, our last set, where we did like half the Aquaria set and then got depressed because it was a lot of work to catch up and go through all of the cards. Um, so I don't really rank cards from like a 1 to 10 like a lot of people do. Instead, I try to think if it's going to be viable for constructed, viable for limited, etc., or if it's going to be very, very popular. I try to make like a judgment call, or if it's just unrunnable. Those are usually the categories that I kind of throw the cards into. There's also like an interesting category, so we'll jump right into it. So we've got Ghostly Pilfer. Whenever it becomes untapped, you may pay 2 if you do draw a card. Whenever an opponent casts a spell from anywhere other than their hand, draw a card. Discard a card. Ghostly Pilfer can't be blocked this turn. So this is a pretty interesting card for a 2-drop. 1 blue, 1 colorless. That's a lot to take in. So he draws you cards if you pay 2 mana. I think in draft, this guy is pretty insane. Like a lot of spot removal for red, depending on like, what we get, like maybe a shock or something else, could end up making him less viable in draft. But in regards to draft, card advantage is pretty much like really, really decent. I know that a lot of times it's tempo oriented, where you need to play bigger guys, this and that, but this gives you an insane amount of cards, so I kind of like it. And then whenever an opponent casts a spell from anywhere other than their hand, draw a card. So that's just like free for like, Chemister's Insight, this and that. There's a lot in the current standard metagame where like, Uro and stuff, where you cast stuff with escape, and that counts toward this guy's being able to draw a card. So pretty good. I think he's like somewhat viable. Not really sure if he like doesn't fit into Flash because you want to keep your mana open for the most part. You don't want to pay 2 because that could be for a counter spell. You want stuff like Sailor where you can pay at the end of a turn, to pump out card advantage and stuff. So he looks pretty viable. It depends on how the meta shapes up. I think he's really good in draft. It's pretty much where it's at. So Mistral Singer, 3 mana. Prowess is a keyword I haven't seen in ages. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, this creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. I'm pretty sure that's a returning mechanic. I could be mistaken, but I think it's it's like an old one that's coming back. So for 3 mana, this thing's pretty good in draft. Don't think it'll see much play in standard because 3 mana for a 2/2. You'd rather just pay 3 mana for a 3/3 or something. That's just better, like just easier to use. I don't think it'll be too viable in standard, but in draft I could see it being pretty okay. It's pretty mediocre. I don't think we'll see it in standard. So Baron Tolarian Archmage, 3 mana. When he enters the battlefield, return up to 1 other target creature or planeswalker to its owner's hand. Ooh. At the beginning of your end step, if a permanent was put into your hand from the battlefield this turn, draw a card. That's a really interesting card. Be more interesting if this guy had Flash, but I think he'd be busted. Ooh, this is hot. So when he enters the battlefield, return up to 1 other target creature or planeswalker to its owner's hand. So this can be used to like reset Narset, like your own Narset, your own Teferi 3, and then play it back down again. To refresh the loyalty, especially on those planeswalkers that can't get it back by themselves, like Narset being the prime candidate there. It can also be used to bounce the opponent's planeswalkers, which is super great. Like, I think this might actually be pretty interesting for something like Tamir Reclamation, but like maybe not because it's 3 mana, whereas Brazen Borrower is only 2. But it could be an interesting option, for sure. It's definitely an interesting like pivot point. Like I could see it being pretty okay, especially since you could use this to bounce your own Brazen Borrower. and then use that to bounce something else and draw a card in the meantime. And it's 3 mana, so like if you have Wilderness developed, it's like it's pretty free just to bounce and draw a card. Might see more people running this in something like U White Yorion or Bant Yorion, where you can bounce your own omens. Since Yorion is a slower tempo play, it's also just good against aggro because you can bounce a creature and just set them back for a second. And you also get to draw a card when that happens, as long as they don't shock this guy before the end step or Bone Crusher Giant. So I like this guy a lot. I think he's pretty viable. He might be a little too sluggish, but I'm interested to see where he's gonna go. I like him a lot. Sanctum of All. So 1 mana of each color. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may search your library and or graveyard for a shrine card and put it onto the battlefield. If you search your library this way, shuffle it. Ooh, that's interesting. If an ability or of another shrine you control triggers while you control 6 or more shrines, that ability triggers an additional time. And then we've got some shrines coming up here, which is pretty interesting. Shrines were a thing back in like Kawigama, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. There were some interesting ones. I'm not versed enough to know if these are reprints or not. I didn't play a lot back then, but I remember a few of them in like EDH or something, I think, too, of more recent times. So I like this a lot. This is pretty interesting. I feel like Ali is probably going to brew around this, like Ali Eldrazi, I imagine. Sanctum of... So let's... Before we like make... Like, this could be viable. I don't know. This is too, like, too sporadic. I'd have to check out the other shrines that we have. And like other shrines they might print in the future, like I'm not really sure. So this could be viable. Probably not in draft because it might be hard to pick up these shrines or just to juggle that mana. But let's see what else there is here. Sanctum of Fruitful Harvest, 3 mana. At the beginning of your pre-combat phase, add X mana of any one color where X is the number of shrines you control. So could be kind of okay for like pump creatures, maybe like Growth Chamber. Guardians, because then you could be like boop, you know, put some into your hand. It could be pretty interesting. Not too impressed by it. It's probably not too viable at the moment. If you're pulling it from your deck for extra mana, it's one thing, but you really have to oh, pre-combat main phase, so it's not during the combat phase. Okay. That's way better then, because then you can use it for whatever its ramp at that point. Like you could play this down on turn 3 and it's not terrible. Like it's like 1 ramp for 3 mana though. And then if you play your next shrine, then it's even better. It seems like some of these shrines are pretty cheap. So like blue, white, like for Bant could be pretty interesting, like just mana ramp that way. Beginning of your pre-combat main phase, each opponent loses X life and you gain X life, where X is the number of shrines you control. Pretty interesting, could tie into like Devotion for black. But like Devotion's been pretty slow lately compared to other decks. Like we don't really see it a lot nowadays. So I'm not really sure. Seems interesting. Sanctum of Cold Waters. At the beginning of your pre-combat phase, you may draw X cards. Ooh. That's really cool. I like this one. It's a little expensive for 4, but if you're pulling it with this, it's not too bad. Okay. So I like the green and the blue one so far. This one's pretty interesting, but I'm not sure how great it is, you know? 6 mana, tap target creature. This ability costs 1 less to activate for each shrine you have or you control. That's really interesting too. So if you have like 3 shrines, it's 3 mana. So that's not terrible. And it's only 1 to develop, so that's the advantage of it. Like that's what's enticing about it. There's another word I'm looking for, but I can't think about it. You can't think of it. So I like this. Pretty interesting to set up for like Bant maybe. Sanctum of Shattered Heights for 3 mana. Discard a land card or shrine card. Deals X damage to target creature planeswalker, where X is the amount of shrines you control. So like you could pretty easily make like a Super Friends dex potentially with the shrines in a way. Like maybe 3 to 4 colors. 5 would be a little greedy, but possible. Like just because this answers planeswalkers, this ramps you to make it easier to develop more shrines, stuff like that. Seems pretty interesting. I'm not sure how viable this is as a whole, but I'm willing to see what like Ali might brew around for this, whether it's historic or standard. 9 lives. Interesting artwork. They usually don't do like real artwork like this. Like not as in like real as in viable. I mean like realistic. Okay, so hexproof for 3 mana. If a source would deal damage to you, prevent that damage and put an incarnation counter on 9 lives. When there are 9 or more counters on it, exile it. When it leaves the battlefield, you lose the game. Oh no. Um, well, it's interesting. Like, I guess if you can prevent combat damage, it's not terrible. It's damage to you, so it's not even combat damage. I don't know, man. This card looks sketchy. I have to like chance for glory this stuff or whatever, and I don't think chance is in standard for much longer. That's super interesting. I don't know what to think about this card. It's too weird. It's definitely unique. I like that it's unique. Um, but I don't know how viable it is. Could be really nice if your opponent has like one big creature that's like smacking you in draft or something, and you can't chump for some reason. Like this could kind of get you there. This does have hexproof, so like the opponent can't bounce it or interact with it. And Cleansing Nova is not in standard right now, so it's not like there's something that can really take out enchantments and artifacts. Um, it's interesting for sure. I just don't know what to think about it. Shacklegeist, 2 mana. It can only block creatures with flying. Tap 2 untap spirits you control, tap creature you don't control. I mean, for 2 mana, it doesn't seem terrible. I don't mind it. I think this is a reprint. I remember this card, I think. So, I don't know. It could be okay in like flyers, like you white flyers or something, but we already have a lot of good creatures for that deck. Maybe this could replace some that are rotating out or something. I'm not really sure. But it doesn't seem like super, super, super fantastic. Like it's not going to break the game, I don't think. In draft, it could be really good because like it's a 2/2 flyer for 2. And depending on like what white gets for flyers, um, this could just keep swinging over and whatnot. Pretty interesting. I think it's good for draft, maybe mediocre for standard. Could see some play. Volcanic Geyser, X damage to any target. Yeah, I'm pretty sure this is a reprint. Um, I mean, it's removal in draft, but I don't think it's good in standard. We could see some people trying to meme around with like ramp or whatever else, or like copying spells and like doing X damage to any target. But pretty much expansion explosion kind of fulfills this role in like reclamation. In draft, it's removal, so I mean, like you probably take it in draft here and there. It's expensive removal, but early game it can take out a 1/1 for 3 mana, for example. So like if it's an engine like the dude that we saw up ahead, like this guy, we can deal 1 damage to him and stop them from drawing cards early. Like I kind of like that. Other than that, it's kind of meh. Like it is what it is. Experimental Overload, create an XX blue and red weird creature token, where X is the number of instances and sorceries in your graveyard. Then you may return an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. Exile Experimental Overload. I love this card. These are the types of Izzet decks that I usually play when I did play Izzet, like where it's just sort of like recursion and value and such. I just love that. Really, really interesting stuff. Could make like Izzet Phoenix come back a little bit. The problem with that deck is that it is weak to graveyard hate as well as like a lot of the other decks. Like we want graveyard hate for like Zenith Flare, so it like falls into that thing where other meta decks are already making it so that sideboards include cards that are also good against you. So it's tough. I know a lot of modern decks run into that problem too, where you want to be creative and your combo just gets shut down by something else in the meta already that people are already teching for. But I really like this card. I think it's probably viable. It's definitely good in draft, I would say. And it could be runnable in standard, especially at an uncommon for draft, or like to experiment with it in standard is pretty much free. So I'll probably check out that card just because I like it. And we've got some lands. Some of these are reprints. This one reminds me of Maine, where I used to live. They're very Maine-like. And yes, these mountains, we've seen them before. This island, yeah. Some reprints there. Ooh, Kite Sail Freebooter, that's a reprint. Pretty decent. When he enters the battlefield, target opponent reveals their hand and choose a non-creature, non-land from it, exile it until he leaves the battlefield. So it's like a 1/2 flyer that can pressure planeswalkers that also just interrupts them. Like it can grab a board wipe and make it so it's a little harder for the opponent to get there. So I like him. Like he's definitely runnable. He's standard viable. Like it just depends on how the meta evolves, whether he becomes good or just medium. And draft, I think he could be pretty decent too because it just interrupts. We'll see how that goes. This card here looks pretty interesting. Sublime Epiphany. So 6 mana instant. Counter target spell, choose one or more. Counter target activated or triggered ability. Ooh, so this is a counter to Crassus for as long as it's in standard while this is in standard. Return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. Okay. Create a token that's a copy of target creature you control. Target player draws a card. So this is a lot. 6 mana is a lot, especially when Dispute is in the meta. So you get to counter something, you get to counter a triggered ability. So it's like, this is only viable against like Hydroid Crassus or like Ulamog or something where people have the spell on the stack plus an effect that's on cast, basically. Or like someone's activating an ability while the stack is going. That could be another interesting interaction. And then the boomerang effect, like, you know, return target non-land permanent. I shouldn't say boomerang because I think boomerang can bounce a land. But it bounces. It's a bounce effect. Create a token that's a copy of target creature you control, so that can be pretty interesting. And then draw a card. So you can always like draw a card, counter a spell, but 6 mana is really expensive for that. I don't think this card's super great. It could be interesting, but I think as long as Disputes in the meta, we have cheap counter spells. Like I think there is one revealed that's sort of like Spell Pierce, but it's a little different. It just can't counter like Planeswalkers, so I'm not sure. We'll have to see if it's good or not. But I'm not gonna hold my breath on this card being super great. I don't think. It just seems too expensive for what it's trying to do. Rada, Heart of Keld. So 3 mana. Elf Warrior, as long as it's your turn, she has first strike. You may look at the top card of your library at any time. And you may play lands from the top of your library. So this is a really good effect for 3 mana so far. I'm already sold on this card being okay. Tap 6 mana, gets XX until end of turn, where X is the number of lands you control. So this was a pretty interesting archetype back when we had like the Raptors and Experimental Frenzy and stuff. I like that deck a lot. So this is another one of those effects where you can play lands from the top of your library. You can't play extra lands, which is kind of a bummer, but just being able to move lands off the top of your library is pretty cool. Like it's basically like drawing a land each turn if there is one there. And if not, you know that you're going to draw into something you can play next turn, which is always comforting. So you know you're not getting flooded out. I think this card's super viable. 3/3 for 3 is pretty okay. And we have to look for replacements for some Groll cards anyway eventually, so maybe this can fill those shoes, you know? So I like it. I think it's super viable. In draft, it's pretty insane too, just to be able to move cards off the top of your library. 3/3 first striker for 3 mana just seems kind of okay. And it scales into endgame, which is super important in drafting. Like 6 mana makes it so she is at least a 9/9, right? Because you have to have at least 6 lands to do that unless you have some sort of ramp. So pretty good. Scavenging Ooze, this one's a reprint. I used to run like a blue-green really bad deck with a Sphinx that was like hexproof or something back when this was in Zendikar around that time. Exile target card from a graveyard. If it was a creature card, put a 1/1 counter on Scavenging Ooze and you gain 1 life. Maybe it was a different one. I think maybe the one that I was thinking of had like counters at the beginning of your main phase or something. I can't remember. But this one's pretty good. This one's like an old one. Pretty sure this is a reprint. Maybe not from Zendikar. Yeah, I'm mistaking the timelines there, but it's a very good card either way. Definitely a really good card for the current meta because we want a lot of graveyard hate. This can threaten to eat a cat all day. can threaten to eat like, you know, just cycling cards all day. Just all day, like grab cycling to make it so that Zenith Flare doesn't hit very hard. On top of that, you're building it up. A lot of their cards, the cycling deck at least, are non-creatures that they cycle. So might not be too relevant there, but it's still nice as a main deck inclusion because it can be a pretty beefy creature. So this guy's definitely like just 100% viable in standard and in draft. He's just great. Platinum Mirror, 2 mana, so ramp. Tap, add 2 mana for 3, so ramp's colorless. Pretty important to have these types of stuff because then you can start ramping in different lists like blue, you know, like not blue-green, but like blue-red, etc. Like it just gives you an option. It's shockable for 3 mana, which sucks, but in draft, I feel like this is really good because you get to play 2 above curve, colorless stuff. It's just great. So for draft, it's awesome. For standard, we could see the play. We could see it, but it seems like maybe a little too slow for standard, but we'll see how it shapes up and if they print any more mirrors that synergize with it. Okay, Hooded Blightfang, 3 mana. Whenever a creature you control with Death Touch attacks, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. Whenever a creature you control with Death Touch deals damage to a planeswalker, destroy that planeswalker. So this is pretty interesting. I'm not sure how many Death Touch creatures we really have in standard at the moment. So I'm not sure how viable this is. I know there's a lot in historic with like the vampires and stuff. But it's pretty interesting. Like it gives you 2 effects. It gives you life gain. It gives you life loss for the opponent, which is pretty neat. And it's 1/4, so it's pretty sturdy for 3 mana. Like that's nice. It's better than like a 2/3, I think. Because 2/3 can get pretty, like, you know, lightning strike if they reprint that, stuff like that. Like especially in historic, could matter. Like 4 is a lot harder to deal with than 3 for the most cases, or like even 2. If this was a 2 toughness dude, it would be really weak. So I think this is kind of viable depending on like what Death Touch creatures we have access to. It means that Questing Beast kills anything that it hits, which is pretty interesting. For like black-green stuff, like maybe black-green adventures or whatever else could be interesting. At that point, you have Murderous Rider. But yeah, I don't want to go into details too much on these. Kind of want to move through the cards, but I like this card. I'm not sure how viable it'll be. In draft, it seems good because it's 3 mana for removal, basically, because you can always block with this guy on a bigger dude, so I like it for draft, too. Rousing Read. I was going to say Rousing Reading, but that's incorrect. So 3 mana. Enchant creature, and when it enters the battlefield, draw 2 cards, then discard 1. Enchanted creature gets 1/1 and has flying. So really good for draft, I would say, because this cycles through and gets rid of your lands, draws you into threats potentially. Standard, it seems a little too slow, especially where we have like mutate and stuff. You'd rather just mutate, I think, for this amount of mana. And it only cycles. And it's not as important to get flying in standard as it is to like as it is in draft. So for standard, I don't think this is great, but for draft, it seems pretty interesting. Like I like it for draft. Dread Maw, 6 mana, 6/6 trample. There's no like cycling or anything on this guy to make him good. I think it's trash for standard, for sure. There are much better things to cast for 6 mana. And in draft, I mean, if you need a bomb, like it can be okay. Like I'd probably pick other stuff over it first, but man, there's a lot of cards. All right, so library, Larceniest. Whenever it attacks, draw a card for 3 mana. I mean, this seems pretty weak. It's a merfolk, but I think there are better merfolks, even in historic, for this. Like you just put Curious Obsession on the unblockable one, right? And it becomes this, but better. It looks okay, ish. Like I don't think it's too viable for standard, and I don't think it's too viable for like historic even. And it seems kind of weak in draft unless you can give it flying with like this or something, and that's like 2 cards that you have to have together to make it decent. This thing just gets blocked, I think, by turn 2 by a 2-drop that has better stats. Like this guy can block him. This isn't a 2-drop, but you get my point. Like there's just going to be a lot in draft that can block this guy unless you can give him evasion consistently with like a different color or with this. Animal Sanctuary. Put a 1/1 counter on target bird, cat, dog, goat, ox, or snake. I mean, it seems interesting if these become like a thing. Like that's a good effect, I guess. since we don't really have proliferation on lands too much nowadays. I think Karn's Bastion is still in standard, but at that point you have to like already have a counter on it, and it takes 4 mana to proliferate on top of tapping the land. This takes 3 total. So pretty interesting. Could be viable if those archetypes are popular. So could see some play. Don't see it being very great in draft, especially if you need 2 or 3 colors, because then it's kind of limiting you from maybe a 1/1 counter. On the other hand, it could just be a win con if you keep pumping up a flyer and they can't deal with it, like pretty insane. But it does have the niche category of like needing these types of creatures. So interesting for sure. Silvermoor Ghoul, 3 mana uncommon. At the beginning of your end step, if you gained 3 or more life this turn, return it to your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So that's interesting because normally these black cards are like if your opponent has lost X amount of life, you get an effect. So having gaining life as the trigger is interesting. And you can sacrifice them and draw a card. That's so cool. I love this card. I think it's pretty viable potentially. You just have to have some way of gaining life, and then like this could just be like, you know, just value city, especially in draft, like where, you know, value might be a little harder to come by. Maybe it's a little harder to gain life consistently, but this is definitely interesting. I like this card a lot. I don't know how viable it'll be in the long run though. At the beginning of your end step, so this is Griffin Airy for 2 mana. Beginning of your end step, if you gain 3 or more life this turn, create a 2/2 white Griffin token creature with flying. Pretty interesting. 1 second. There we go. Just had a sneeze there. So speaker, okay. So that ties in with this type of stuff. So like if you have an engine to gain 3 life, then it's pretty good to have those types of cards like black white potentially. And to be fair, white is probably the second best color to have to gain life compared to maybe black. So this is interesting. I'm not sure how viable it is. For 2 mana, just to be able to drop it and then have a value engine for late game, it's pretty interesting. Because then it's like 2 mana for a 2/2 flyer. And then like after that, it's just profit, right? So that's kind of nice. Vigilance lifelink, so 1/1 lifelink for 1 mana. Create a 4/4 angel creature token with flying. Activate this ability if you only have at least 7 life or more than your starting life total, and only anytime you can cast a sorcery. So pretty interesting. This might fit into some historic decks with like Soul Sisters, or not Soul Sisters, but the other cards that are like Soul Warden and whatnot, and the Ascendant there. Could be pretty interesting. I like it. A lot of potential for that in historic. For standard, I'm not so sure. Like maybe a lot of life gain could be okay, especially with these other effects. Could be interesting. Could be viable. Terror of the Peaks, 5 mana. Spells your opponent casts that target Terror of Peaks cost an additional 3 life to cast. Ooh, that's an interesting stipulation. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, Terror of Peaks deals damage equal to that creature's power to any target. Oof, so that can go right to the face. This makes me think like Big Red's coming back, maybe, right? That's pretty interesting. Because then if your opponent tries to target it with, I guess Teferi 3 can still bounce it, but hopefully that's less of an argument later on when he rotates. So it's pretty interesting. I like it. I think it's pretty viable for standard, depending on how it evolves. Like we could see it in Gruul potentially or something else. Like I'm not sure. It does take a while to get going. Might have to do like we don't have fires to be able to slam this guy plus other stuff now, so that'd be very powerful with fires, but that's not really consideration too much anymore unless it becomes unsuspended and historic. But pretty interesting. I like him. And draft is just insane because it's a 5 mana flying that costs your opponent life to deal with. If they can't deal with it, it costs them a lot of life, right? Finishing Blow, 5 mana, destroy target creature or planeswalker. Just great removal for draft, too expensive for standard. We have like Eat to Extinction and such, right? The Exile for 1 less mana. You know, we have better cards in standard, but for draft, I could see it being really, really nice. Like it's good to have removal even if it's a bit expensive. Battle Right Shaman. 4 mana at the beginning of your combat. On your turn, you may have target creature get +2/+0 until end of turn. This seems really expensive for an uncommon. For 4 mana, this could be like a common. I'd say that this is pretty trash, both in standard and for draft for the most part. Because then you're looking at a 4/2 for 4 mana almost. Like you could boost something else that's like a flyer, but Like it doesn't seem great unless you're really synergizing with flyers and getting boosts and stuff. I don't like it too much. Unstamptiate. That's probably me butchering that card's name. Return target spell or creature to its owner's hand. So this is pretty interesting. This is like almost like a remand effect, except that remand counters. It's more like a Narset's like reversal type thing where you can put the spell back to its owner's hand. It doesn't stop the effect of the card, but something that says cannot be countered can still be bounced to their hand while it's on the stack, which is interesting. Like you can stop Dovin's Veto with this, for example, to push through your like Teferi or whatever. Could be an interesting sideboard tech card for like Tamir Reclamation potentially. I like it. It does something unique, which is awesome because it can bounce a creature or a spell. So like this can even bounce like Ceratops back to their hand, just to stall them out until you can get like an Elspeth Conquers Death or something, etc. to deal with it. In draft, it's a pretty good tempo play too for 2 mana. You can stop them from like, if they go to enchant a creature, you can bounce the creature and like mess them up a little bit, or you can bounce a spell for tempo. It's really decent. I like it. Very viable, I would say, for both standard and draft. Not sure how viable for standard. It depends on how the meta evolves. Discontinuity. So for 6 mana, as long as it's your turn, the spell costs 4 less to cast. End the turn. Exile all spells and abilities from the stack, including this card. The players whose turn this is discards down to their maximum hand size. Damage wears off, and this turn and until end of turn effects end. So we've had a few of these effects in regards to ending the turn in previous sets of Magic. I think Kawagama is the one that I remember the most. So it's pretty interesting to see this mechanic come back on top of like Prowess and stuff. Seems like they're bringing back a lot of old mechanics. This isn't necessarily like a mechanic, but you know what I mean. Like it's just an effect that we don't see too often nowadays. This is a mythic as well, which is pretty interesting. I like it a lot. I think it's very interesting. And this, as long as it's your turn, the spell costs less to cast. Well, why would I want to cast this on my turn? Is the question. And it's like if your opponent's casting a bunch of stuff at the end of your turn, you can take it all off the stack and then give it back to your opponent. Like, you know, pass priority back to them and such. It can be pretty useful in certain situations for sure. It's very interesting. Especially if your opponent's like contesting you super hard on like trying to blow up your creatures and everything on your own turn. It's very useful. I like it. It'll probably be viable for sure. Even at 6 mana, it's like you end your opponent's turn, which is almost like Nexus of Fate in some sense. You do exile this card though, which is pretty interesting. Like you could Narset's reversal this card, dude, and then put it back into your hand. And then have another copy come onto the stack, right? Pretty interesting, pretty fun. Glorious Anthem. So this is a reprint. This is an old one, oldie but a goodie. So creatures you control get 1/1 for 3 mana. And we could see mono white, we could see Mardu Knights try to run this, but it's like 2 white mana, so it's a little expensive for decks that are running like more than one color. Especially where you want to curve it out and have this like while you have 1 or 2 creatures out already. I don't know how viable it'll be now in standard compared to other stuff that we have. It's also weak to Teferi bounce, etc. So it could be interesting. We'll probably see some decks try to run it, especially like mono white potentially. It's a good card. It could definitely be good in draft too if you have enough creatures to make it worthwhile. Nyabi, Esteemed Speaker for 2 mana, so this is a rare as well. Something to note. When it enters the battlefield, you may return another target creature you control to its owner's hand. If you do, gain life equal to that creature's converted mana cost. Discard a legendary card, draw 2 cards for 4 mana, tapping them. So he's pretty interesting because he can bounce something and gain you life. So he could be a blocker, like a chumper, as well as just bouncing a card that you can't block, like something with trample potentially. And you gain life, so the bigger the creature, like converted mana cost, the better he becomes. So I like him a lot, or her a lot. I think it might be a her. I can't really tell from this resolution. But pretty interesting. I like this a lot. I think it's super viable, especially for 2 mana, man. This card's definitely really, really strong. Especially with the upside that it could be a draw engine later in the game. When you have extra legendary stuff, it means that you can get away with running more legendary creatures in your deck. Like, let's say you have 4 of these, you know, you discard the other one to draw 2 cards. Seems good, you know? Fills the graveyard for stuff like Uro as well if you're in Bant colors, etc. Very, very nice. I like it. And in draft, it could be really, really good too. It's good tempo. Karvak, the Spiteful, 4 mana. Other creatures get -1/-1. Rip tokens, dude. This is definitely good for 4 mana. It's like it can be a mini board wipe on top of just being shuts off like Castle Ardenvale and stuff. Like normally things that control might sometimes use to finish out the game, you can stop with this card. Also, human warlock, like warlock's a cool keyword to have, like a creature type. I like that a lot. So I like this one a lot. 3/2 can be, it's like shockable, it's Bone Crusher Giantable, but like other than that, it's quite strong. Like just being able to board wipe as soon as it hits is pretty interesting. So I like it. And also -1/-1 in creatures, so something to consider. Definitely viable for standard and draft though, I would say. Just nice because you can get a lot of the creatures like this one just right off the table. Liliana's Devotee. So zombie creatures you control get +1/+0. At the beginning of your end step, if a creature died this turn, you may pay 2 mana, 1 black, 1 colorless. If you do, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. This seems like a reprint, but maybe not. I've just seen effects like that before. So pretty interesting zombie support. A banner for zombies. We haven't seen that in a while. Oh, pretty interesting. I'd say it's really viable for draft, and it could be viable for standard if we get a lot of support for zombies, but I'm not sure. It seems like a meme anytime something like that comes up where it's like kind of themed for zombies or humans or something, you know? So, could be really good though. Liliana's Standard Bearer, 3 mana, flash. When it enters the battlefield, draw X cards, where X is the number of creatures that died under your control this turn. So you could swing out a bunch of zombies if they get chumped, or if you block on your turn and you chump with a bunch of zombies, you could draw like, you know, 3 or 4 cards from this. Pretty interesting. I like it. Seems viable if zombies get more support. Like we only see a little bit here and we don't have a lot in standard for zombies per se, but I'm interested to see where it'll go. We'll go to the second page here. This is still pretty long. A lot of cards to go through. Oh, we'll try to get there. So Liliana Stewart, 1 mana, sacrifice it, target opponent discards a card. Activate this time only anytime you could cast a sorcery. So like, I'm not really a fan of this because it's Summoning Sickness. You have to tap it in order to activate it, so it has to come back around to you. It's a 1 turn, 1/2. So I'd much rather see like a Duress. It is a zombie, so like you could combo it with the other zombie cards we saw there, but it doesn't seem very powerful. It seems kind of slow and dirtily. Could be interesting in like draft if you get the synergies going, but I don't think it's too great for standard. Just seems too dirtily. Canopy Stalker, cat. 4. Canopy Stalker must be blocked if able. When it dies, you gain 1 life for each creature that died this turn. So kind of memey. I would say it could be okay in draft if you need some life gain, if you've got some like supports. But the problem is like it's a one-time thing, right? Unless you have some recursion with black. So it just feels weak overall. I don't like this card too much. Like I like it because it's a cap, but that's about it. So not too viable, I would say. Like this effect is interesting. Like it has to be blocked. Like you can make your opponent trade with a flyer, but that's about it. It's only good in like low creature situations, and then like I think I'd rather just have a removal spell at that point instead of a bad creature. Falconeer Adept, 4 mana. When it attacks, create a 1/1 white bird creature with flying that's tapped and attacking. So this is really good for draft. I would say like 2/3 for 4 is a little bit weak. If you can beef this guy up or just make sure it's safe to attack with him, it seems fine. I don't know. It doesn't seem great. I don't think it'll be good in standard for sure. Doesn't seem powerful enough. Most commons and uncommons probably won't seem that powerful for standard, but there's some exceptions for sure. Don't think it's that great though. Watcher of the Spheres, 2 mana. Creature spells with flying you cast cost 1 less to cast. Okay, that's interesting. For 2 mana for a 2/2 flyer, this already seems pretty good. Bird Wizard. The wizard support and historic potentially. I know a lot of times we want red for that, but maybe blue, white, red, maybe Jeskai could be interesting. Whenever another creature with flying enters the battlefield under your control, Watcher gets 1/1 until end of turn. So just like almost like a Wee Dragonauts effect for whenever you cast a flyer, which is kind of cool. Much weaker than that because Wee Dragonauts is insane with its power spike damage, but it's interesting. It's good. I'd say this is definitely viable both in standard and draft. I would say in standard, if we can get some more flyer support, it could be very good. Just because we've already like saw a few other creatures that are good for you white flyers or whatever already printed in just the set alone. So the meta shifts a bit. I could see that being pretty viable. The Kraken, Valarian Kraken, 6 mana. Whenever you draw a card, you may pay 1. When you do, you may tap or untap target creature. So for draft, this is pretty interesting because it's a 4/6 kind of a bomb type deal. And then whenever you draw a card, you may pay 1. So like at the beginning of your turn, you can tap down a creature each turn so you can keep swinging through. Or if you can draw on your opponent's turn, you can tap 1 mana and then tap down their biggest threat. And then you can swing through the next turn on top of preventing damage. So interesting in draft, not viable in standard, I don't think. Too expensive. Brash Taunter. Brash Taunter. There we go. 5 mana. Indestructible 1/1. Whenever it is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to target opponent. This reminds me of the Blasphemous deck back in like Boros, or like I think Strider Stone is probably gonna try to cast Star of Extinction while this thing is on the table just to win the game. Which I love and hate, because I'll probably have to play that deck in a donation deck thing eventually. Whenever so tap 3 tap, it fights another target creature. So like if you soup this guy up, he can be pretty interesting too. I think mainly it just gives you an out to deal damage to your opponent, like when you go to Deafening Clarion, etc. But I think mainly it's not that great of a card by itself. It definitely takes some setup to get rolling and whatnot. It's pretty interesting, but I don't think it's great. Okay, definitely Mimi. Duress, oldie but a goodie, definitely viable in both main deck and sideboards across the world. Like this card's always been runnable, especially in the sideboard. Defiant Strike. So this used to be ran in like Feather and stuff. Other than that, I haven't really seen it too often. It's just cycle and you get to draw a card. So could be useful. It's definitely kind of interesting in draft. Like definitely a good filler card if you just need more cards to throw in. I mean, we've seen it before. It's pretty viable. It's okay. It's nothing to write home about, but we could see it in a couple of decks here and there. Ranger's Guile, 1 mana. I think this is a reprint. Target creature you control gets 1/1 and gains hexproof until end of turn. So pretty interesting. Mono green's probably going to make even more of a comeback. Like it's already making a bit of a comeback. Like a lot of people are bringing it to like Mythic, top 30, etc. You see it on Twitter here and there. Pretty interesting, and this should push green over the top a little bit more. Definitely good in draft and viable in standard, I would say, even. Like whether it be for Groll or just mono green. I like it. So enthralling hold, 5 mana uncommon. Enchant creature, you can't choose an untapped creature as the spell's target as you cast it. You control enchanted creature. Ooh, so we haven't had this in a bit since like Volition Reigns and stuff. Like we haven't really had like I guess Bolus's something. I can't remember what it was called, but there's a Bolus card that allowed you to take control of something. I think I still use that in like an EDH list somewhere. But we haven't really had that for a minute, so uh, it has to be a tapped creature basically for a target. Other than that, you can take control of a creature for 5 mana, which is pretty interesting. Like, I like it, but it seems a bit expensive. It's definitely awesome in draft because it's basically removal. Plus, you get something else. I don't know why this card is popping up again. We've already reviewed this. It was in the last set of cards. So I don't know why that's popping up twice, but this is definitely viable for draft and a little slow for standard, but we could see if the format slows down enough for this to be super great. Just feels bad with like Teferi and other things that just bounce cards to their owner's hand because they'll just get their card back. Feline Souvenir, 3 mana. Other cats you control get +1/+1 and have protection from dogs. Okay. I haven't seen any dogs yet, I don't think, that I reviewed so far. Whenever one or more cats you control deal combat damage to a player, destroy up to one target artifact or enchantment that players controls. This is a really decent card just for 3 mana, 2/3. It reminds me of the adventure card that, like, you know, when it came through, like when it gets through combat damage, you get to destroy an enchantment or artifact if you sack it. It was like the girl, I can't remember her name, but she can also produce like bears for 6 mana or something. So this is pretty interesting. I would say that Gem Razor makes this card less good, but if we have cat support and everything else, it could shape up to be okay. I'm optimistic on the whole cat dog thing because I think it's fun. So I have high hopes for this card, but I'm not holding my breath. In draft, it's definitely great to have the enchantment and artifact removal, especially when it doesn't have to be this card specifically that hits to be able to trigger. Gourmand, 6 mana. As an additional cost to cast the spell, sack a creature. Flying Trample for 5/5. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices a creature. Oh, this thing's a bomb in draft. Like, that's just super nice because you can sack one of your lower CMC creatures, your lower value creatures. You get a 5/5 flyer with Trample out, which is pretty significant because they can't block it like late game just with the little dude to prevent damage. They have to tank it all. So I like that a lot. On top of that, it's removal that can get around hexproof potentially if they have nothing else on the field. So very neat. For standard, it's 6 mana. It's just too much. You have stuff like Doom Whisper, etc., that are just better trample demons, and those don't even see play. So, but for draft, I can definitely see it being good. Truffle Snout, 3 mana. When it enters the battlefield, choose one. Put a 1/1 counter on it or gain 4 life. Interesting for draft. I think we have better support for life gain and or counters in standard, like Knight of Autumn, for example. I mean, yes, this is mono green, but you know, even so, it's better to splash for color to have a better card effect, I think, than to just have a dude that can gain you 4 life. It just doesn't seem very very explosive or very powerful. For draft, it seems fine because it's a 3/3 at the worst case, and then if you need life gain, then it's fine too. Especially if you have like recursion or you have this guy to sack something, like it could be okay. There's not anything to write home about. Wildwood Scourge, X mana. When it enters the it enters the battlefield with X/1/1 counters, so whatever you tap for it. Whenever one or more counters are put on another non-hydro creature you control, put a 1/1 on this dude. So this is pretty interesting. This is definitely a bomb in draft, I would say, because it's not only a late game card, like if you have 5 to 6 mana and you make like, you know, a 4/4 or 5/5, but you also have the upside of it being like a 3-drop for 2/2 if you absolutely need creatures down to block or just to have some field presence. You can cast this at any time. Now we have better hydras right now in standard, but some of those will rotate eventually, like Voracious Hydra and Hydroid Krasis. But I think this is a good draft card for sure, and it could replace some of the other hydras once they rotate, or if we need an X effect, like it could be okay. It doesn't seem very viable for standard though. It's not powerful enough, I don't think. Even if you're putting 1/1 counters on other things, this doesn't seem that great. Maybe I'm missing something, but yeah, it just doesn't speak out to me that much. Tempered Veteran, 2 mana, Human Knight. Put a 1/1 counter on target creature with a 1/1 counter on it. Put a 1/1 counter on target creature for 6 mana. So it's a 1/2 for 2. If you already have counters, it could be really good in draft. Could be okay in standard, but it seems very weak for 2 mana that just gets bone crushed. And it's like you already have to have a counter on something else. And that something else has to be like a 1-drop or a 2-drop, and then you played a 2-drop and then a 2-drop. It just seems kind of weird and bad. I would say that I'm not too impressed by this card. It could be interesting in draft because, you know, late game value is king sometimes. So could be interesting, but I'm not gonna write home about it. Conclave Mentor, 2 mana. If one or more 1/1 counters would be put on a creature you control, that many plus 1/1 counters are put on that creature instead. When it dies, you gain life equal to its power. So pretty interesting for 2 mana, I would say. Very good for draft because it just has a good stat line. Like 2/2 for 2 is fine. And then it has the upside of whenever you put a counter on, so it makes this guy better, etc. It's very interesting. It's definitely decent for draft. Could see it in Selesnya tokens or something if we could boost enough creatures, if there's still enough of that deck left after rotation, or like to make it work before it rotates out. So pretty interesting. Not too excited about it though. Thieves Guild Enforcer, 1 mana, 1/1 flash, so I'm already intrigued. Whenever it or another rogue enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent mills top 2 cards. So they're making mills into a keyword. I remember someone mentioning this in my stream chat. It's pretty interesting. As long as an opponent has 8 or more cards in their graveyard, Thieves Guild Enforcer gets +2/+1 and has Death Touch, so a 3/2 Death Toucher for 1. And it flashes, so it can get yourself, you can get yourself to the mill point to where if the opponent has like 5 cards already, or 6, it'd be 6 cards, right? 6, mill 2, and then she's online as soon as she comes in. I mean, I like it for the 1/1 flash Death Touch. Like, this is definitely like a good card for draft because it usually goes to late game, and mill can be really funny. Like milling 2 cards and then your opponent loses the game potentially is always a hilarious option. I love it, but I know it's not that viable unless there's a lot more mill stuff like there was in Eldraine. So pretty interesting. I think it's probably viable for draft. And standard, it could be viable depending on like how much support we have for that. Enforcer, tap target creature, activate this ability only if you can control a creature with flying. So 3 mana, 2/3. You can see it being great in draft, like just if you already drafted some flyers, because even if you don't get to use its effect right off the bat, it threatens to use that effect later on in the game. I don't think it's great for standard because it's just too expensive though. Sabertooth Mauler, 4 mana, Kitty Cat. So we had a lot of cat support up above. At the beginning of your end step, if a creature died this turn, put a 1/1 counter on Sabertooth and untap it. So this thing can just keep swinging through if they chump and threaten to block as well in the backswing. Very interesting. Probably okay for draft, but I don't think it's good in standard. Just seems too slow for 4 mana. Sporeweb Weaver, 3 mana, reach. So this thing has some keywords on it. Reach Hexproof from blue. Whenever Sporeweb Weaver, oof, that alliteration there. Not quite alliteration because I think alliteration technically is the beginning sounds, but Sporeweb Weaver, so web and weaver, is dealt damage, you gain 1 life and create a 1/1 green sapperling creature token. So if the opponent's just swinging wide, they don't really make much progress, which is cool. I kind of like it. I think it'd be really good in draft, and it could potentially be okay for like a sideboard card, but it doesn't seem that important in standard because most Shark Typhoon tokens could probably just swing through it anyway. Could see it being kind of okay versus like you just wouldn't want to bring it in over other cards is the thing. Like if you have Tamir Reclamation, for example, and you're staring down like Teferis and Shark Typhoons, this isn't doing it. You know what I mean? It's not quite good enough for that. But I could see it being very interesting in draft, especially as like a sideboard card if you're doing best of 3. Or just as a general card to produce tokens and block, 2 and X cards, or even 3 and X cards if you're not afraid of a combat trick. So interesting at best, I would say. Subtria to Tolzidi, Carva Runner, something like that. 3 mana haste. 1, another target creature with 2 or less can't be blocked this turn. Power 2 or less can't be blocked this turn. Tap 2, discard your hand until end of turn. Whenever a creature you control with power 2 or less deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. Wow, this card's very interesting. I think it's very viable for draft, and it could be viable for standard potentially if you just have a dump your whole hand and go all in type deal, like maybe mono red with some support. It'd be very interesting, especially where you can make your creatures unblockable, basically. Another target creature with 2 or less can't be blocked this turn. Yeah, so yeah, unblockable for certain cards. It's a human shaman, so some human support exists in standard right now, but I don't think it's super relevant. Yeah, just super interesting. I love it. Very low to the ground decks could get away with a lot of stuff with this. I'm interested to see how this pans out. Viren Wingmare, 3 mana, flying, 2/1. Non-creature spells cost 1 more to cast. So we've had these effects before, and they've been very powerful in standard, but I think usually they're like 2 mana. So they get down a little bit easier. This is also a 2/1, so it's very very susceptible to removal. But I like it. It could be a decent sideboard card. I don't know if we'll see it a lot in the main deck. Most flying decks typically want a few cantrips or a few counter spells to protect their board state here and there anyway, so I'm not sure how popular it'll be. Garruk's Harbinger. So for 3 mana, hexproof from black, so not protection, it's a little different. They can still block it and such. They just can't target it with kill spells, basically, from black or hybrid black cards. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker, look at that many cards from the top of your library. You may reveal a creature card or Garruk planeswalker from among them and put them into your hand. A creature card. And put it into your hand, so 1 target. Put the rest on the bottom in any order. So 3 mana for 4/3 is already a pretty good stat line, and then you could get lands off the top of your deck. You can put them into your hand, so it's like pseudo, like, it's not ramp per se, but it guarantees land drops, which is pretty good in most cases. I like it a lot. I think this thing's definitely like pretty decent in draft. Like, yeah, you can block it with a 2-drop or a 3-drop if it has free attack, but it can't be black, and it just gives you like advantage, which is super important, especially if you draft like a Garruk in draft as well. It could be an upside. And in constructed, I could see it being kind of okay in like mono green if we're running Garuks, or like if we have Garruk, like the black, the Golgari Garruk potentially with support with like a wolf deck. It just gives you different options, which could be very interesting. I don't know how viable it'll be overall though. It seems a little slow and dirtily for 4/3 for 3. Yeah, so we've got Garruk Unleashed. So this card's very good. This was already spoiled to me. I was watching a streamer go over this card, but up to 1 target creature gets 3/3 +3/+3 and gains trample until end of turn. So that +1 is already pretty strong. And he's 4 mana for a 4 toughness, so he moves up to 5 instantly if he wants to. And he can protect himself. Like 4 mana -2 makes a 3/3 that can block for him. Makes him vulnerable to like Bone Crusher and other removal like Shock, but if you don't really care about that too much, it's still pretty good. You get an emblem, so it's -7. So the -2 also has another effect. Then if an opponent controls more creatures than you, put a loyalty counter on Garruk. So it's really only a -1 if your opponent has more creatures than you do. Now it has to be more as soon as like after you get the 3/3. So if they have 2 creatures, you have 1 creature, you -2, you don't get the loyalty back, right? So something to keep in mind. It's still a very nice upside just for free, though. It's interesting. The emblem is you get an emblem with, at the beginning of your end step, you may search your library for a creature card, put it onto the battlefield, and then shuffle. So pretty powerful. That pretty much ends the game eventually. Like, it's very hard for the opponent to continue answering one creature each and every turn on top of what you cast normally. Especially if you have another Garruk like pumping out 3/3s and such. Like, it's going to be pretty hard to deal with. So I think he's very good. I would say that he's going to see play both in draft and like limited and standard for sure. Mono green will love him, I think. Rambunctious Mutt, 5 mana doggo. When it enters the battlefield, destroy target artifact or enchantment. Even in draft, I would see this guy being only like sideboard. I'm not sure if he'd be really, really viable for the main deck in draft. In standard, I don't see it being played at all. It's just too weak. Reason being is because it's just too expensive for 5 mana, even in draft, to just blow up an artifact or enchantment, unless we know our opponent's going to be playing those, which is why it goes in the sideboard for the most part in draft. Fierce Empath, 3 mana. When it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a creature card with converted mana cost 6 or greater, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. Really strong in draft because it gives you a 1/1 blocker. And it gives you some late game, and at 3 mana, you can kind of develop this on turn 4 or 5 and kind of set up for your next turn as well, or just play it early and get some value down. Just in regards to putting something into your hand, it replaces itself. This is very good for draft. In standard, I could see it being used in like some combo decks, maybe, but for 3 mana, you could just pay 4 and have like an actual, like, you know, search your whole library for anything that you wanted. So I don't know. It seems okay for draft, but not too great for standard, I would say. Oh, this is cool art. Nice. We got Valor Steed, 5 mana, Vigilance. When it enters the battlefield, create a 2/2 white knight creature with Vigilance. So this is putting basically 5 attack, 5 toughness onto the field, split between 2 creatures for 5 mana, which is fantastic in draft. Like, that's a lot of bodies and a lot of blocks, a lot of attacks that we could have if the opponent doesn't really have a board state, and it leaves us back with blockers. So I like it for draft. It seems too weak for standard. It's just not strong enough for 5 mana. It's just too weak. Furious Rise. 3 mana. At the beginning of your end step, if you control a creature with 4 or greater power, exile top card of your library. You may play that card until you exile another card with Furious. So that's pretty interesting. So like exile the top card. So it's forced, so you can't just sit on a card. You have to cast the card that you exiled the previous turn before the next one goes on the stack, unless you just don't want to and you want to see a new card. This is pretty interesting. I'd say in draft, it just gives you some extra value if you have a lot of 4 powers or more. It just gives you an extra card draw each turn, basically. And it says you may play that card. So like if it's a land, it's super free, right? That just gets lands off the top of your library, which is awesome. In standard, I don't know. It could be ran in a few decks that are kind of niche, but I don't think it's great. Maybe some Ali Eldrazi decks, some combo decks could see play, but I don't know. It just seems kind of weak for standard overall. Transmorgify. So 4 mana, sorcery. Exile target creature. That creature's controller reveals cards from the top of their library until they reveal a creature card. They put that onto the battlefield and shuffle it. So this is just like almost like, why run this when you can run something like Luca that does the same effect but is a planeswalker that can do other things as well. Just seems kind of weak overall. So I'd say this isn't great. It's like, it's okay. For draft, it's definitely too weird, I think, to really make use of. It could be used as like a spot removal for something really, really, really dangerous, or when you want to get value off of one of your cards. Like, you know, if you want to get value off of your 1/1 here, just to get something else onto the table, especially if on average your creatures are just going to be stronger than that. It could be interesting, but I don't think it's super duper viable compared to just having a Luca. In draft, I don't know, it's weird. Like I said, it could be used as removal, but it's niche for sure. Oh, this is an oldie but a goodie, huh? I thought I saw this on Twitter, but I wanted to see it for myself to believe it. So we've got Solemn Simulacrum, 4 mana. When it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land card, put that card onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. When it dies, you may draw a card. So we see this a lot in the recurring, like, you know, return target artifact or permanent from your graveyard to your hand. It gives you ramp in non-green decks, which is awesome. Just a great card overall, and it has artifact support. So like if you have stuff that reduces the cost of artifacts or whatnot, it's just really, really, really great. And he not only ramps you, but he draws you a card if he just dies straight up, like if you trump with him. So just a great card overall. Love him. Definitely gonna see play in standard and in draft for him. He's just great. An awesome card, A tier card. Rest here. Alpine Watchdog for 2 mana vigilance, 2/2. So basically a bear, but it has vigilance for 2/2. Bear is like, it's a vanilla, it's a 2/2, but it also has vigilance, which is kind of nice. And it's a dog for the keyword for dogs, so could definitely see this being really great in draft because of its good stat line for 2 mana. Great early game pressure and blocker. It's just nice. Like vigilance is always super cozy. In standard, I don't see it being too great. Like unless we really want dog and cat support. Hellcat Punisher, 7 mana is quite steep for 6/6. Flying, it gets 1/1 until end of turn. Very strong fire breathing effect here for this. I would say in standard it's way too expensive to cast, but in draft it could be one of the biggest bombs that I've seen so far in the set. Just the fact that you can finish the game by pumping with the rest of your mana here. If you have 4, that's hitting for like 10. If you just have 4 mountains on average, by the time you get to 7 mana, not a lot to ask for. So great threat and drat, not runnable in standard, I don't think. Heartfire Immolator, 2 mana Prowess, so we get the Prowess keyword again. This is the second time we've seen it so far. Sacrifice it, it deals damage equal to its power to target creature or planeswalker. So pretty interesting because you can like pump this a little bit by doing like, you know, pump my dude and then sack it to deal like 5 damage to a planeswalker. Could be very interesting, especially in draft where we don't have a lot of answers, especially in red, to planeswalkers. Like this could kill a Garuk, you know what I mean? Pretty easily at that. Just need a little bit of mana to cast a spell or two, especially if it's a pump spell, and then just 1 more mana to sack it. So very, very good in draft since we can remove planeswalkers. It could even see play in standard if we really need answers to planeswalkers in red, but usually red just tries to run down the opponent for the most part and deal with planeswalkers just by simply swinging at it. They don't really want to lose creatures in exchange for that tempo. Goblin Arsonist ran a lot back in the day. I think this was like Innistrad or something. I can't remember. It's been a while, but I remember this card. Gets kind of outclassed by Sideways Monkey in Historic for the most part, but could still be ran in Historic, especially in like maybe Cavalcade lists. I don't think Historic Cavalcade's a thing. This could be ran in Cavalcade right now. Just in Standard, it could be okay. Gives you another really good 1-drop for that. It's just interesting. It's good. Probably not so viable in... It could be okay in draft, but the 1/1 really feels kind of weak unless it's trading with something. Like, I don't know, it feels weird. It's hard to analyze draft when we don't know what the whole set looks like yet, but it seems like pretty viable. Just in general, like it's been ran in the past, it might be ran now. We'll have to see how the meta shapes up for it. Fiery Emancipation, 6 mana. If a source you control would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals triple that damage to that permanent or player instead. So in draft, this could be really good late game just to slam down if you have a bunch of tokens or a bunch of like smaller creatures. It could be very interesting because if a few of them get through, it's good. And if they don't, they trade really well because they're doing triple damage. So it's great in draft, I think, if you can afford to get to 6 mana if the game's not supposed to be over by then. Like I said, it depends on how the limited format shapes up overall. We don't know if it's going to be an aggro heavy format, if it's going to be control heavy, if it's going to be like, you know, mid-range heavy. Like we just don't know how that's going to shape up until we see all of the cards and we get some other, you know, analyst for draft in there. But I like it. It seems pretty interesting. In standard, it's kind of hard to swing the 6 mana, especially when it could just get countered or bounced or something. You really need something to win you the game, and this could do that, so it could fall into that category. I'm just not going to hold my breath on it for standard that much. Like, it doesn't seem too strong. Like, it seems strong, but it seems clunky. Garuk's Gorehorn, 5 mana for a 7/3. Could be okay in draft, but 3 probably just gets blocked and traded with pretty easily, even if it's just with 2 creatures, like a 1/1 and a 2/1 or whatever. You'd have to be able to put trample on him or do something else. I don't think he's very good. He's definitely not runnable in standard. Frantic in inventory. Frantic inventory. Okay, there we go. It was like I saw a creature, so I thought it was a creature spell here. Did draw a card, then draw cards equal to the number of cards named inventory in your graveyard. Ooh, I love this card for standard. This is so cool. This is so nice for the Is It Phoenix decks and such. Like, it just gives them so much draw power. And it's cycle for 2 mana. I guess in draft it could be okay too if you just need cycle, but probably not great unless you can draft like 3 to 4 copies, maybe 5 if you get really lucky. People are just passing them around because they don't want them. I love it, but I don't know how viable it'll be. Like we don't see Radical Idea or anything else for the fillers really being great, but this doesn't bring you down cards at all when you go to cast it again. Like, you just cast it and then cast the next copy, etc. So it could be really interesting, but I love it. I like it, but I don't know how good it'll be. Lofty Denial, 2 mana. Counter target spell unless its controller pays 1. If you control a creature with flying, counter that spell unless its controller pays 4 instead. So for all these U-White flyer decks, it could be very interesting. I like it. It could be very viable. In draft, because, like, you know, anything that requires mana or stipulations that are sort of restrictive, such as needing a flying creature to make it good, could be really, really rough to run in draft. But in standard, like, you could see maybe flyers list if those become popular. This could be like a really strong, like, sort of like the Lookouts Dispersal type tier where you'll see it ran. Something that you have to respect if that deck becomes popular. Leafkin Avenger, Elemental Druid, so a little bit more elemental support for the ones that we might be losing. 1 mana for each creature you control with power 4 or greater, so itself included, so it at least ramps for 1 after it comes out. For 8 mana, it deals damage equal to its power to target player or planeswalker. So not creatures, but can go direct to the dome if we end up pumping the sky a lot. That could be pretty interesting. Could be a win con. I could see this being viable in standard until, like, we lose some of the elemental support that we have. Like, I think Omnath is M20, I believe. I think that'll rotate eventually. Like, I know it'll rotate eventually, but I mean, like, soonish. What I mean. So I like it. It could be very decent in draft, just because, like, late game, it's a 4/3 for 4, so that's not terrible to begin with. And then it can snipe planeswalkers, which is awesome, just as a backup. So far, we've only seen Garruk, so it could hit Garruk for a bit. But that's really expensive. Garruk might be out of control by then anyway, so but before you can really develop stuff. So we'll have to see. Snoop for 2 mana. Pretty fun artwork there. Play with the top card of your library revealed. You may cast goblin cards from the top of your library. As long as the top card of your library is a goblin card, Snoop has all activated abilities of that card. That's actually really cool. For 2 mana, 2 red, it's a little harsh. But if you're just running mono red goblins, it seems really fun. Like, I could see this being used in, like, Brawl and stuff, where you can have, like, Krenko as your boss of the gym, like as your commander or whatever you want to call it. So I like this guy a lot for different formats. Even in standard, he could be good if there's enough goblin support. Like, we got War Boss and stuff. Some of this stuff's rotating, but we might get some more reprints of goblins that are pretty interesting. So I like it. He's very cool. Tyrannodon, 2 mana defender for 3/3. As long as you control a creature with 4 or greater, can attack as though it doesn't have defender. So pretty good, I would say. Like, this is great for draft. It could even be great for standard, depending on, like, if you need more beefy creatures to kind of slow down the other aggro lists if you're running more mid-rangey. Mid-range right now is almost dead as an archetype. Like, I think Jund Food is the closest we have, but this is definitely cool. I like it for draft for sure, and for otherwise it could be pretty good. Okay, we're almost through here. So you've got the Oak, Burl Fist Oak for 4 mana. Whenever you draw a card, it gets +2/+2 until end of turn. So it's a 4/3 for 4 mana, with the upside of like if you draw another card, you get to make it a 6/3, or not a 6/3. Oh wait, it's a 4/5, 4/5 for 4 mana. So this is not terrible. This is an aggressive card though. You'd have to draw on your opponent's turn, so you'd have to be in like blue or have some weird effect from a different color that allows you to draw cards on your opponent's turn. But on your own turn, it's a 4/5 no matter what that you can swing in with, and you can threaten to draw another card if you're in blue to make it like, you know, a 6/7 or something like that. So very strong, I would say, for limited. Not so much for standard though. I think it's just too bad, like too inefficient for the mana. Like I'd rather just cast a Questing Beast, right, and have haste. Better. So it's really hard to compare those cards for standard, but for draft it could be good. Riddle Form. Oh yeah, this is a reprint, isn't it? We had this back where like blue red wizards was the thing in standard a bit ago, like Ixalan type deal, I think. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you may have Riddle Form become a 3/3 Sphinx with flying in addition to other types until end of turn. So it's still like an enchantment and such. 3 mana Scry 1, so end of turn you just have a Scry engine, which is pretty interesting. It's slightly cheaper than Castle Vantress by, what, 2 mana? I think Vantress takes 4 total. 2 blue, 2 colorless, then you have to tap Vantress itself, I think. So cheaper Vantress. Lower to the ground doesn't wreck your mana either, like you don't need 2 blue. So pretty interesting. I mean, we've seen it ran in the past for standard, so potentially moving forward, this could be very, very good, especially for control. Like being able to threaten to swing in with a 3/3 each turn is kind of nice. Sort of weak to Shark Typhoon, like a bigger Shark Typhoon, but more lower to the ground, something you can develop early game for 2 mana. Threaten to swing in with each turn to, you know, hit our set or whatever else. It's nice. I like it. Definitely good in draft and could potentially be pretty good in standard. Light of Promise, 3 mana. Enchant creature whenever you gain life. Put that many 1/1 counters on this creature. So lots of support for this, like creatures that we've seen that have like, you know, if you gain 3 life, do this or do that. The problem is like we don't have a lot of gaining life thus far in green or blue, or not green or blue, but green, black, or white. I think where a lot of these cards are like, you know, if you gain 3 life, you get to do X or Y or Z even. So I'm not really sure. It seems kind of weak to removal for 3 mana. Could be very, very spiky in draft though. I don't think it's too great for standard though. It just seems too susceptible to removal. Garruk's Uprising for 3 mana. It enters the battlefield. When it enters the battlefield, if you control a creature with 4 or greater power, draw a card. Creatures you control have trample. Whenever a creature with 4 or greater power enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. So there was a card that cost like 3 or 4 that did this before, where it was like at the beginning of your turn or at the end of your turn, if you controlled something with 4 or greater power, you would be able to draw a card. This is that on like, you know, uh, just on steroids, if you will, or whatever. Like it's just on just amped up on Mountain Dew, let's say, more friendly version. So it's just really, really crazy. So when it comes like, yeah, so like you draw a card instantly if you already have a 4 or greater power, and whenever you play another creature, you draw a card. So it's sort of like a Kiora effect almost. It is Kiora's effect. So very interesting. It gives you trample too for all these beefy dudes. Definitely in draft, it's going to be a bomb, like just something that's really, really hard to deal with. Like it makes all of your creatures into bombs basically. Like this guy, for example, Vigilance, when it becomes the target of a spell and ability controls, you may draw 2 cards. It becomes a 5/7 trampler instead of just something that your opponent can chump each turn. So it just turns all of those cards online. It makes like Lovestruck Beast into a tank, like just a Panzer tank. Like it's just insanely good. So I like this a lot, both for standard and draft. I think it'd be interesting in like mono green potentially too. Treacherous Greed for, oh wait, let's do Warden. So 6 mana, Vigilance. It's good in draft. I don't think it's great in standard. Like, just too much mana for too little. I know we say that a lot about the big bombs, but I mean, they all kind of fit into the same category most of the time. Treacherous Greed, 4 mana. Gain control of target creature until end of turn. Untap that creature, it gains haste. Add 2 mana of any one color. Oof, so this is a 2 mana steal a creature. But you have to have 4 initially to cast it. So, but then you get 2 mana back, so you can use that to like pay for another card to sack it or do something weird with it. Like, it's super nice that it just gives you mana back. It's super strong. This is like Active Treason, but better, basically. Active Treason, but you know, it costs 1 more mana, but you get mana back. So if it resolves, it's really nice. Comes down 1 turn later, which could be very significant. Probably viable in both draft and standard potentially. Meteorite, 5 mana. When it enters the battlefield, it deals 2 damage to any target. Tap, add 1 mana of any color. I mean, it's removal, it's expensive, but it also ramps you a little bit. So if you have a top end in draft, it could be interesting, especially since it can remove something like an engine, something that like generates value for the opponent that's drawing them cards and stuff, and you just need to stop the bleeding. On top of that, it ramps you into being able to do more than one thing a turn. So pretty interesting. I'd say it's viable in draft just because removal might be scarce from what we've seen so far. And this could be very, very, I think it's just too slow in standard for the most part for 5 mana. Could be interesting with like Karn to grab it from your sideboard, this and that, but I think there are just better targets for Karn, the Great Creator, like to grab stuff from your sideboard, but could be interesting, could be an interesting option for spot removal. I'd just rather pay 2 extra mana and like Meteor Golem at that point, you know? Ingenious Curse, so this is an elemental doggo, 2 mana. It gets +2/+0 until end of turn, so it's pumpable. Seems okay in draft, like just to threaten to swing in. Usually people won't block it because you can pump, and then you can just use your mana for other stuff, which is kind of nice. I like it. Probably not too viable in standard. Could be okay for Cavalcade, but for 2 mana you have much better options like haste creatures and whatnot, or just better options in general, like stronger cards. Doesn't seem too great. Alpine Houndmaster, Human Warrior, Boros colors for 2/2. So already efficient stat line for 2 mana, and it has a lot of text. Let's see what it does. When it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a card named Alpine Watchdog and or a card named for reveal them. Also, this guy here. And then shuffle your library. Whenever Houndmaster attacks, it gets +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is the number of attacking creatures. So this could be kind of an interesting deck, like Boros colors with aggro. Like, this is super efficient, sort of like Cobblade was a little bit, where you get extra cards from your deck as you cast other cards. Very efficient, could be very powerful, both in standard and draft, because this is a common and this is an uncommon. So if you get 1 to 2 of these with 2 or 3 of these, just very strong being able to get extra cards from your deck. So I like this both for draft and limited now, or sorry, limited and standard potentially. I'd like to see where that goes. So that'll be the first half of the spoilers for now. We'll do another video with 3 and 4 pretty soon, and then I'll keep doing videos as they come out. So I appreciate you guys being awesome and chilling out today. Hopefully this was helpful and kind of giving you an analysis of what I think the cards might do eventually. And I'll see you guys on the next video. Thanks for stopping by.